Ready? Okay. Yep. Okay. Yep. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mayra Fajardo, and today I will be sharing with you guys my research project based on the potential correlation between the amount of times per year a male high school student participates in their own religious activity and their weighted GPA. I know that may seem like a lot, but bear with me. I will walk you all through all of my steps in my processing. So basically, an introduction, the main two topics of my research analysis today are theology and education. My faith is such a big part of my life, as well as obviously education being in high school, and I really wanted to see what kind of effect faith had on my other classmates and other peers, specifically the male demographic. So to begin with, before I go into my processing and all of my research, it's important to understand how I got to the gap and my specific research question. The first part of my literary review, I studied some sources that identified that there was gender differences in religious participation. Many of these sources identified that women tend to be more religiously participant than men. For example, in an article published from Science Direct, written by Dr. Joanna Malesko, she analyzed the gender differences in religious practices, spiritual experiences, and health. My second set of sources for my literary review identified religious participation and its effect on psychology and mental health, specifically in teens. I had a source that published article from the Journal of Family and Economic Issues that analyzed religion and child health, religious affiliation, importance, and attendance and health status among American youth. And lastly, my third set of sources talked about religious involvement in education, such as an article published from the Marriage and Religious Research Institution analyzing religious practice and educational attainment. All of these sources basically identified and talked about religious involvement in teens, whether it was their psychology, mental health, whether it was their education, or whether it was the differences between males and females. This leads to my gap. The main thing I noticed was that most of my sources focused their research basically on women and talking about how women tend to be more religiously participant than men. After doing my research project, I realized why. There was a lot of difficulties dealing with young men, but it also leads to the second part of my gap, which talked about none of these sources talked about specifically grade point average, specifically weighted grade point average. Most of these sources talked about how religion affected someone's behavior or psychological effects or mental health, but nothing specifically about grades. This leads to my final question, which is, does religious participation have a direct correlative effect on the weighted grade point average of a male high school student in a private Catholic school in South Florida? Now, some of you may be thinking, why is this important? Why should this matter? Well, my research project does not only affect students, but it also affects parents, policymakers, and teachers. It can benefit students' development and inform parents on the potential benefits of religious involvement and private schooling. It can also help policymakers to take a sign as to allow students to integrate religion into academic performance in schools, private or public. So this can affect multiple people in our society as to see whether it can benefit or hurt students to be more religiously participant and of how it affects their grades. So this leads me to my hypothesis. I hypothesize that there will be a significant positive correlation effect on my high school males' GPAs based on their greater level of participation religious. Basically, I think that the more religiously participant a male high school student is, I think that that will increase their weighted GPA. Before I get into the specific parts of my study, there's a couple key terms that we have to go over to understand everything about my study. To begin with, what do I classify as religious participation? Since this is a new study, I had to identify how I was going to measure religious participation. In the purpose of this research project, religious participation is the sum of religious activities each student participates every year, such as Mass, prayer, adoration, or confession. Next, I have Mass or religious service. This is typically the celebration of the Eucharist. It is a weekly ceremony offered for certain religions, usually more Christianity-based religions. Next is youth group. It is a group of young people often organized by a religious institution that aims to provide social, recreational, and/or educational activities for its members. I also have praise and worship. This is an allotted time slot where one can honor and glorify God through song, prayer, and scripture. Adoration is the highest form of worship, typically a Catholic celebration where they spend time in reflection, prayer, and often song in the presence of the Eucharist. Confession or reconciliation is a sacrament, again typically offered to the Catholic Church, where individuals confess their sins to a priest, receive absolution, and are reconciled with God and the Church. Liturgy of the Word is an opportunity offered specifically to this private school students to present a testimony on a Bible verse every week with their peers. And lastly, Alpha or Leadership Ministry is a class offered to these students, specifically seniors, to become leaders in their environment and also lead religious retreats every year. This leads me straight to my method. I chose to do qualitative mixed methodology. Basically, I chose to do survey and content analysis. My survey was basically made up of a Google form that I sent out to 210 subjects or students. It was made up of 24 questions. 10 were short answer questions, and 14 of them were multiple choice questions. My content analysis was basically I had to look at all of the high school males' GPAs and I had to find the average, which was I will lead on to later on is about 4.2. I also had to find the average participation. I added each student's daily participation in each of the categories for religious participation, and then I would divide it by how many categories there were, and I had to find the average for all the overall students as well as each individual student. And then lastly, I had to content analyze all of my survey results. Leading into this is the high school average that I found in my study. So according to the child psychologist and researcher Steven Zauder, the American National just male weighted GPA is about a 2.9. However, at this specific private school, it was about a 4.2. This is simply to show you guys that there is a big discrepancy between my specific study and what it would look like on a national level due to the specific category of Catholic schooling that I have. And the weighted participation, the average religious participation for this specific schooling was about 374. I also show you each grade level and how they were a religious participant, but we're focusing on the total number right now, which is 374 times a year a student participates in a religious activity. Now, I had to lead into exactly how this participation was going to be measured. As I said before, this was not a numerical value that has been studied before, so I had to identify how I was going to turn this qualitative measurement into a quantitative variable. For example, the way I would do this is if a student answered that they prayed once a day or they went to Mass once a week. If they said once a day, I would count that as 365 times per year. If they said they did something twice a week, that would be 104 times a year because there's 52 weeks in a year, so on and so forth. Similarly, I did all of that in that methodology in a year timeline. Now, I also had to explain to these students that all of their religious participation only counted if it was voluntary or outside of school. It could not be something that they were forced to do or mandated. School prayer does not count, and school mandated Mass or church did not count. It had to be their own voluntary activities. And then lastly, I had to annotate every student that was above or below the average to make that cutoff line of how I was going to measure if it was participant or not. I added every single student that was above the 374 line as well as above the 4.2 weighted GPA line, and that's how I dedicated if there was a correlation or not. Now, this is a timeline of how I chose to conduct my surveys and how I gave them out to the students. I started with the seniors, who gave me about 42 surveys. Then I moved on to the juniors, 58 surveys. The freshmen gave me 63 surveys, and the sophomores gave me 45 surveys. I did this in about a 2-week time period where I went into these religion classes and I offered the survey up to students who were willing to participate in my study. These are some sample questions from my survey that were multiple choice. I asked questions such as, how frequently on average do you attend Mass or religious service? And the answer choices were every day, a couple times a week, once a week, a couple times a month, once a month, or a couple times a year, or I don't attend. Another question might have been, how frequently on average do you have personal prayer time or meditation? Some of my sample short answer questions where I asked some of the students what religion they were affiliated with or what ethnicity they were. I also asked questions how they believed their grades were impacted by their religious activity, or whether or not they believed their grades or religious participation had increased or decreased over the past year from 2023 to 2024. This leads me straight into my content analysis. When my data was measured straight from the Google form, my raw data, it showed up like this on Google Sheets. What I did was that every student was an anonymous number. I had no names, so I only saw the student's grade and then the numbers that they chose. Whether it was twice a year, I put the number 2, or like I mentioned before, every day was 365, where I added all these numbers and then tallied it up. I also measured a separate Google Sheet for their GPA and their grade-based questions, so I could line up each student with their GPA and their religious participation total number. What I did after this was that I had to cross-analyze both of those sources. I wrote down every single student that had a higher than a 4.2 weighted GPA. Then what I did was I highlighted those out of those students who had also above a 375 participation for their religious activities. I will show you later on exactly what those percentages look like, but this is just to show you how I did that cross-analyzation and how I identified each student. Out of the 210 students that participated in my study, 99 of them had an above average GPA. This means that 47.1% of the students had above a weighted GPA of 4.2. Now, out of those 99 that had an above average weighted GPA, 45 of them also had an above average religious participation, meaning that 45.5% of those students that had above average GPAs had above a 374 religious participation score. To take another way to look at this, I also asked the students if their grades increased or decreased and if their religion participation increased or decreased. What I found was that 54.8% of the students had an increase in both grades and religious participation. 28.6% of my students had stayed the same from the year 2023 to 2024. And 16.6% of my students had an increase in grades, but a decrease in religious participation. I still was not getting a clear result as most of my data was leading to a 50-50 mark, so I chose to take a closer look. I picked the top 6 students with the highest male GPA, ranging from a 5.7 to a 5.4. Of this, I found that 3 of the students had a below average participation, but 3 of the students had an above average participation. So my data was still leading to 50-50 results. So to really hone in, I had to take it to statistics to measure the variability of my data. My correlation, or my R value, was a 0.1128. For those of you who don't know, the closer a number is to 1, the stronger the correlation is. The closer a number is to 0, the weaker a correlation is. As you can see on my chart, there's a slight positive correlation, but many of my data points are scattered about and not closer to the line of best fit. This trend showed me that however I thought there was a small positive correlation, it wasn't enough to have a strong enough correlation to be closer to 1 since my R value was so close to 0, being a 0.1. To really measure if there was a significance or not in my variability, I went ahead and measured my p-value. For those of you who don't know, many statisticians say that if the p is low, the null hypothesis must go. A null hypothesis is a statement assuming that there is no effect or no relationship between variables. Basically, this served as my baseline to measure if this disproved my statistical hypothesis through my testing. As you can see, my p-value was about a 0.102. It was too high to show that there was enough statistical evidence to prove that there was a correlation. You want your p-value to be lower because the lower your p-value is, that means the more unusual your data points are, meaning that there has to be something leading to this correlation. It can't just be by chance. Another way to look at this is that my z-score was 1.27, showing that nothing was unusual in my data since all of my points were still between the 2 standard deviations of regular data to my mean. What does this mean? Basically, this means that my hypothesis was not correct because there was not enough statistical evidence to prove a strong correlation between my data. My null hypothesis was incorrect. However, this does not discredit my research. I still filled the gap. My study's findings did prove that most students experience a change, however small, in their motivation and their grades, the more they participated in their religious activities. This is supporting the evidence that I found in my first scholarly articles that there is some relationship between religion and students' academic performance. Just not enough to measure the specific correlative value between these 2 data points as grade point average and religious participation. This leads me into my limitations. I do understand that there are some things in my project that held me back that other researchers can do better next time. Some of my survey questions were not taken seriously and not answered to the full extent because students did not understand them very well. I also understand that there are things such as IQ, tutoring, advanced classes, and learning disabilities that affect a student's GPA. There's a lot of confounding variables that limited my study very much because I didn't take into account all these different things like IQ, advanced placement, different honors and academic courses. I also had delimitations. These are things that made my question too specific that made it harder to answer my question. My sample size, although 210 is a big enough sample size, it's not big enough to measure on a national or even a state level because it is such a small and specific school. Also, because I chose to do a private Catholic school, many of these students were from the same religion, causing my data to be a little bit more skewed because everyone had the same religious background. Similarly, the cultural background in this small private Catholic school in South Florida, all of these students have similar cultural and backgrounds as well as same ways of being brought up, which led to my demographic being very small because there was not very much variability or randomization in my study. How can other researchers build on this? It would be really interesting to see other researchers see how maybe religious participation affects a female's GPA, to see how this can affect even things like people in the workplace, or how it affects student sports or extracurricular activities, or how it affects other cultures like I mentioned before. These are my sources. Thank you.
Mayra, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were the most important in informing your new understanding?
When I first gave out my survey, like I mentioned before, I had a couple short answer questions that were involved, such as what religion are you in specifically, or what ethnicity do you belong to? And I chose that, although that did matter to like future researchers, it was not specific to my question. So things like what ethnicity people were in or how old they were not really included or focused on in my study. I mainly focused on the quantitative math variables, like the number of data that they gave me and their GPA, and I chose not to really look at their opinions as much because it really wasn't impacting my study as much.
Myra, I know you touched on this a little bit, but how do your findings provide directions for future research in this field?
So my findings, along with like not only what my conclusion was, but also my method, I feel like really helps because I not only did a survey and I gave the survey questions in my research project of how other researchers can base it on, but I also did content analysis and showed how the average GPA and how religious participation is measured, which was not a quantitative variable before this study. I had to determine how I was going to turn that qualitative variable into the quantitative, and future researchers can really build on that and use that same math that I use to make that quantitative variable into other projects.
Thank you.
What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how will you apply it to future endeavors?
I really had to learn how to make good time management because I had only 6 months to do this research project and 2 weeks to hand out these surveys to the students. With those 2 weeks that I handed out the surveys, I had to take all of those values and do all the math to turn them into the quantitative variables that I needed. So I really had to learn how to manage my time, and I can use that in anything moving on, not only research, but moving on, I have to know that a study has certain time limits that I have to stick to, and I have to really manage my time to make it happen. Thank you.